subject of this audiovisual dissertation is a movie about an astronaut stranded alone on Mars who has to use his ingenuity and fighting spirit to survive. But if you were hoping for this, I'm sorry, what you're going to get is this. There are many things that make The Martian an enjoyable film, but the starting point is the 2011 Andy Weir novel, which is a masterclass in the hardest of hard science fiction. Now, there are no prizes for guessing the base novel for Robinson Crusoe on Mars. It was the 1719 novel by Daniel Defoe entitled... I think the marketing lads and lasses might want to do a bit of work on this one. Never mind unwieldy, it must hold some kind of a record for the number of spoilers you can get into a title. And in these enlightened days we just call it Robinson Crusoe. And the original title is a sort of health warning about what the prospective reader will be subjected to. Now, if you're into early 18th century politics or elementary economics, it may hold some interest, but if you're expecting a gripping beach book, well, you may be a tad disappointed. So I would argue it's probably not the best start for a blockbuster movie aimed to get plebeian 20th century bums onto cinema seats. Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsell, an astronautical systems engineer looking at movies that are set in space and how they impact our culture's perception of space flight. And in one past video, while looking at 1955's Conquest of Space, I quoted John Bosson, who opinioned that this car crash movie killed serious space movies for more than a decade, until Kubrick's 2001. Now, there were several comments on that video contesting the good Mr. Bosson's analysis, along the lines that there had been serious space movies between Conquest and 2001, most often citing Robinson Crusoe on Mars as an example.
This is Commander Christopher Draper of the Navy of the United States of America, planet Earth. Former co-pilot Mars Gravity Probe 1.
So let us start with the story. As a rule, I try and avoid spoilers in these reviews, as I feel the best way to experience a film is to let the story unfold the way the makers intended, with all the character development and the twists revealed in the correct context during the viewing experience. But in this case, the title is a massive giveaway. It quite literally is the story of Robinson Crusoe transplanted onto Mars. But of course, stories don't just transplant themselves. Another writer needs to create the screenplay, and in this case the process starts with E. Melchior, a writer, film producer and director with a bias for science fiction. He sold the initial script to Paramount, and apparently at that stage it had a lot more monsters and creatures than the end result. Once in Paramount's hands, a second writer, John Higgins, did a rewrite, apparently to make it more budget friendly. A change for the worse according to Melchior, but also a change that made it closer to the source material. And to be fair, they do not try to hide that this is basically Daniel Defoe's story, which it was quite safe to do. The novel was way out of copyright, and the long-dead Defoe would not be coming after them for any royalties. So the movie pretty much lifts the main beats from the source novel. A novel which is often cited by commentators, especially in the prefaces to the many editions currently in print, as the first novel in the English language. I'm always rather cynical about such claims, as my bookshelves are full of famous novels where some erudite professor confidently states in the preface that this is the first ever novel, or this is the first novel in English, or this is the first modern novel. In the case of English, I would point to Le Morte d'Arthur, which despite its French title was written in English around 1470. However, Robinson Crusoe was written before we could expect any good story structure in novels. That will have to wait until the end of the 18th century. So while its continued popularity suggests the story premise might be a winner, the actual story is not the best narrative to slavishly follow and expect a winning script. It also means that some inherent anachronistic tropes survive the transfer. The most famous part of the story is when Mr. Crusoe joins up with a native that he calls Friday, never mind his actual native name. Of course, this has to be included, embracing the white man's superiority message. Now, I have seen arguments that this relationship is different in the movie. Well, yes, it's the difference between 18th century slavery and mid-20th century racial segregation. However, even a weak and morally questionable storyline can be rescued by good acting performances that draw you into the character. But no luck there either. Portmanteau as Commander Kit Draper is wooden and humourless. So for me, it's nearly 2 hours following a character which, frankly, I couldn't care less about. Indeed, after 2 hours, I'd be cheering if a nasty alien death ray had burnt him to a crisp. Preferably slowly and painfully. The performance contrasts very unfavourably to Matt Damon's portrayal of Mark Watney in The Martian. Here we get to care for the character partly because he retains a sense of humour, which is often how real people respond in high-stress situations. The humour does not break the tension or the perception of risk, it just highlights the humanity of the protagonist. Now, in fairness, I should point out others, with lower standards than myself, have a higher opinion of Robinson Crusoe on Mars as a piece of entertainment. So, if it intrigues you, then you may get a better viewing experience than I'm suggesting. But aside from its entertainment value, was this movie a serious space film? Well, it was made by Byron Haskins, the same director as Conquest of Space, and his stated intention was indeed to make a serious space film. I think the problem here is that Mr. Haskins could not recognise a serious space film if it danced into the room dressed in a sequined catsuit accompanied by marching band playing serious space films are here again. So while it may have been the director's intention to make a serious space film, in my view he failed comprehensively. For instance, if this film is so accurate, why does Haskins repeat the classic fairy space bollocks of a glowing asteroid that seems to be able to target the spacecraft? This trope was the accuracy low point in his previous Conquest of Space 8 years earlier, and surely its absurd nonsense must have been drawn to Haskins' attention. Yet here it is again in this supposedly super realistic movie. The analysis of the film's nonsense gets more interesting when we look at the spacecraft. Let us start with the Mars spaceship. Conquest of Space had Von Braun's Project Mars as the source for the spacecraft, but it's very clear that neither Von Braun, or indeed any expert, got anywhere near what we have at the start of Robinson Crusoe on Mars. But then again, neither is it complete nonsense. It is clearly intended to be powered by a nuclear engine, although exactly what type is not clear, as the nozzle is rather strange. Whatever it is, the propellant tanks are ridiculously small, so nobody has done any proper sums. The tanks might only be symbolic, but I guess I should be grateful that they're there at all. It also has quad control thrusters, which were already being shown on the early Apollo spacecraft designs, and the habitation elements are also picking up on design concepts floating around the young NASA. The main cabin being a pressure cylinder compatible with a launch system, it actually scales to be similar in size to the latest Skylab. This brings me to one of the big disappointments. The film budget did not extend to a set for the spacecraft's interior. All the in-orbit scenes show the astronauts located in the very cramped landers, which they have no good reason to be in. These scenes would be more natural in the main cabin. Indeed, it is so awkward and silly, it emphasises they avoided making another set, which if you're trying to take the audience into space was rather an important thing to show. It certainly confused the young me when I first saw it. I just could not make out how the crew was living in such a cramped space for the whole journey to Mars. It really would not have been that difficult or expensive to knock up a proper cabin set. Well, that brings us to the two landers. These are mounted off-centre, which would cause an imbalance, a design mistake no astronautical engineer would make, but tellingly the sort of thing aircraft engineers do, as they can take out such imbalances with aerodynamic surfaces. The landers detach from the main spacecraft, which presumably stays in Mars orbit, although that's not made clear. And here is one of them landing on Mars. And if you know your historical spacecraft, it will look very familiar. It is a direct crib of NASA's Gemini. Now, of course, Gemini was not designed to be a Mars lander, nor is it in any way a good basis for a Mars lander. So it raises the question, why would a film that is purporting accuracy have this piece of silliness? Well, at the time, Gemini was NASA's hot new project, and rising in the popular consciousness as to what a spacecraft should look like. So what is going on here? There are elements of real spacecraft, some half right, others just plain wrong, but presumably enough to make it look real for the 1964 audience. So how did this strange concoction get created? I'm guessing here, but I think the problem lies with the technical advisor, who is credited as an Edward V. Ashburn. I have no idea who he is, but the best I can find on the web suggests that he was an expert in high altitude flight. That is, an aeroplane man, not an astronautical engineer. And here we hit a problem that starts in the late 1950s. As space became a real thing, the nearest industry to what was required was the aircraft industry. So the nascent space industry grew out of the aeronautical industry, which had become very technically sophisticated after the Second World War. But while it was the nearest industry, in reality it was not very near. Astronautical engineering is a very different beast, and this wasn't appreciated at the time, and to be honest, it still isn't in most places. This confusion led to the invention of the word aerospace, which is generally credited as being first used in a dictionary created in 1958. It's a word that rapidly caught on, mostly because it suited the agendas of so many of the players at the time. But in the context of what is actually going on, the word is pretty much meaningless. So, I have seen the word used to mean just the space industry. I've also seen it used to mean just the aeronautics industry. I've also seen it used to mean both the aircraft and the space industry when combined. And this results in confusion that has led to many serious misunderstandings, even, indeed especially, at government policy level. The only time this word has a real meaning is in those very few systems that have both aeronautic and astronautic content, specifically aerospace planes like Skylon, that both fly in the atmosphere and in space. You can see the lumping of aircraft and space together with the creation of NASA, which was a response to the Soviet Union launching the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1. It was literally the mashing of the Civil Aircraft Agency with several non-military space projects which were nevertheless being run by the military. The point I would make is, why call it the Aeronautics and Space Administration rather than the Aeronautics and Astronautics Administration? Because the speed with which the space activity grew within the aircraft industry meant that many involved did not even know that there was a separate discipline with a half-century history. There's an interesting comparison with the formation of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics 5 years later. The difference here is that one of the founding societies stretches back to the pre-war origins of space thinking. So it's not surprising if the production team of Robinson Crusoe on Mars thought by getting an aeronautics expert they were getting a space expert. And to be fair, the end result is better than the ludicrous nonsense that are created when it's just left to the art department. There's a sort of half-real logic behind it, showing that somebody half understood what should be there. But if you've ever spent days rearranging the layout of a spacecraft, desperately trying to get the centre of mass through the thrust line, you just look at this and you say, nah. And then we get to the science of Mars itself. Well, of course, we now know it's completely wrong. But at the time, it was consistent with what little was known, or rather thought to be known, of the conditions on Mars. However, there is a little more of making Mars fit the story rather than the story fit Mars, but this is just nitpicking. Credit where it is due, the film did not just create a fantasy Mars. The movie premiered in June 1964. Just 1 year later, Mariner 4 flew past the planet and destroyed even the most pessimistic scientific beliefs as to what the surface of Mars was like. And thus, the surface of Mars in the film instantly became an unrealistic fantasy, which I think has a lot to do with the subsequent perception of the film. It was saddled with the baggage associated with science realism that can dampen the story, and it certainly does here, while not getting the brownie points for realism, which if done properly can enhance the audience's perception. Now to argue another problem. Conventional wisdom clearly suggested a story about a stranded astronaut just solving survival problems was never going to make an interesting film. So to pep it up, they added some aliens, which is always a dangerous route if you're going to go for realism. You might just get away with it if you use humanoid aliens, but aliens that are indistinguishable from human beings is never going to reinforce realism. And I think this is further undermined by the alien spaceships. They may look suitably different from anything terrestrial, and of course, who knows what an alien spaceship would look like. But this has a flying saucer vibe which I think does not exude reality. But I think worse, they also bear an uncannily close resemblance to the Martians in a well-known movie version of War of the Worlds that had been made a decade earlier. Many think they just reused the same models, but they hadn't. But it is the same director, and more importantly, the same art director, who was clearly stuck in a bit of a rut. The problem being that in harking back to a more fantasy film, ups the fantasy quotient in this one. Okay, I'm sure by now you've got the message that this is not my favourite film, not by a long way. But again, I must in all fairness acknowledge that other people with more suspect taste do like it. That said, let me explain my issues. At the start of the movie, we have an in-space sequence showing the spaceship Mars Gravity Probe 1. I've already had my say on the ship itself, but the way it's depicted as a high-speed aircraft is not at all the experience of real spaceflight. Now, you may argue that this is before the real footage came out from Gemini, so how would the film team know that spacecraft seem to just float, regardless of their velocity? Well, I would say 1950s serious space films depicted this very well, one of which was directed by Byron Haskins himself. So while it gets the story, such as it is, established quickly, it's not an immersive we are in space experience for the audience. But credit where it is due, once on Mars the film makes a pretty good job of a convincing Martian surface by using Death Valley and some processing to make the sky Mars-like. It's wrong, of course, but if you forget that it's supposed to be Mars and just assume it's a generic alien planet, it works pretty well. But a reasonably good representation of a planet's surface is not going to hold an audience's attention for the best part of 2 hours. What we need is a gripping, engaging story told through some class acting. What we have is a well-known classic, so we all know the story before the film starts, and it's hardly a Hamlet full of nuance and complexity and open to new interpretation. Further, in our current culture, the book is mostly experienced in an abridged version for children, so not only is it rather weak, but it also has more than a whiff of the juvenile about it. The juvenile feel is then reinforced in the final stage with the introduction of B-movie aliens, following the tropes of the previous decade. And all this leads to a messy, rushed end that doesn't flow from the narrative. Was this supposed to be a serious space film? Well, clearly from the director's statements on the marketing, yes, that was the intent. The problem is that the film's production team did not really have the ability to create such a realistic film. They're running on fairy space conventions without the knowledge to correct the fantasy. Now, this is the director and organisation that produced Conquest of Space, which, for all its dramatic faults, is arguably the most accurate fictional depiction of spaceflight ever committed to film. The key difference is the technical advice they take. Although generally speaking, technical advisors have precious little impact on the scientific accuracy of films, they're simply an additional creative input. However, in this case, I think we can see the impact of their input. The Conquest of Space could hardly have had a better, more eminent astronautical guru. On the other hand, Robinson Crusoe on Mars had an aeronautical expert, and neither the film crew nor, I suspect, the expert himself understood just how unsuitable that background is to advise on spaceflight. So in the end, despite its intentions, this is definitely not a realistic space movie in the same league as Destination Moon or Conquest of Space, let alone 2001. As for whether it's worth watching as a piece of cinematic entertainment, well, I wouldn't recommend it, but many others seem to think it worth 2 hours of your valuable time in this universe. So it's up to you.